I would almost want to put and then it kind of comes around the yard, and I feel really good
Okay, just waiting for everybody to settle in. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mylène Simard. I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Bookseller itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're gathered here tonight to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Where Tenderness Lives, on healing, liberation, and holding space for oneself by Heather Plett, a loving exploration of what it means to unravel what we've learned from our families, societies, religions, and cultures in order to heal and create purposeful and a joyful life. We're grateful to Page 2 for publishing this volume and for arranging this celebratory evening. Following a conversation around the book, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. If you're here in person, I will approach you with a microphone so that the people watching from home can hear you. And if you are watching from home, you can enter your questions in the chat, and we will do our best to pass it along. I'll be back at the close of the event to cover the signing procedures, but just to preface it, we'll just ask you to remain seated for a moment while we transport Heather over to her signing desk, and then you may all join her to get your book signed. Hosting the conversation tonight is Saleha Alsheri. Born and raised in Saudi Arabia for the first half of her life, Saleha came to Winnipeg as an international student in 2007. She finished her second BA in psychology in Canada, then pursued her master's in cognitive neuroscience from the Netherlands and returned to Canada for a master's in counseling psychology. Saleha is now a licensed psychotherapist working with various communities and providing culturally adjusted therapy to visible minorities in 2 different languages. In her free time, she enjoys spending time with her 3 kids, and she thrives on deep and meaningful conversations with her friends. And our special guest this evening is Heather Plett. Heather is an international speaker, facilitator, and author of the acclaimed book, The Art of Holding Space. She's also the co-founder of the Center for Holding Space and has trained people from all over the world in her Holding Space Practitioner Program. Her writing has appeared in publications such as Harvard Business Review and the Globe and Mail, and has been referenced in curriculum for nurses, hospice care workers, yoga teachers, and military chaplains. Please join me in welcoming Heather Plett.
Thank you, Len. Thank you. It's good to see so many people here. Are you picking this up? Stop by saying something? You're running the show here.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I am so glad to be here with all of you. I'm so happy to be here with my friend. we just went through so many things together, really, and we talked about a lot of stuff, and we had a lot of healing conversations together. And we're here to celebrate her, and I'm so happy to be part of this. So, starting with conversation, I would like first to ask you about the book, because we're here to celebrate you and the book. So tell me more about your intention and your hopes and aspiration in writing this book.
Well, I think my intention is to invite more healing for people, invite more meaningful conversations. As you know, you and I have been in many, many conversations. And so I love to be in deep and meaningful conversations with people who are doing healing work, who are unraveling some of their own trauma and baggage, generational baggage and things like that. And so this was me putting a little seed out into the world to grow more opportunities for those kinds of conversations. And really I've always found stories a really, really meaningful way for me to engage with my own healing work. And so it's a gift. I'm offering my stories as a gift for those people who might be impacted by them.
Wow, that's amazing. And can I ask you, like, just to follow up to that? And that's actually not written here. I just thought about it, if that's okay. Just like the moment when you realize that I would like to write this. Do you remember that?
Well, I think it kind of came out of, so my first book is The Art of Holding Space, and I've done a lot of training internationally on this concept of holding space and trained people who are supporting other people in all different kinds of roles and walks of life. And fairly soon after I'd written, I had a blog post go very viral on that subject after my mom died. And fairly soon after that, I really had a powerful insight that people needed not just to know how to hold space for other people, but to hold space for themselves. So as this work grew and grew, I thought, what's the way that I can offer them a model for holding space for themselves, for doing their own honest, authentic, unraveling work so that they can be more healthy in relationships, can hold space for other people, can get some of their own baggage out of the way when they're holding space. So I think it was an evolving process. And I don't know that there was one moment that I remember that this book has to come into the world, but it was more asking that question, what's the next book? What's the next thing that I can offer into the world that feels related to the last book, but is an invitation into deeper reflection for people.
Wow, that's beautiful. Okay, can I invite you now to read just a little, because we have questions after that. So a passage from the first part of the book, which is The Girl and the Velcro Dress.
Sure, so just to give a bit of context for this story, and I need my reading glasses because my eyes are getting old. So I wrote the prologue and the epilogue are this kind of continuing story called The Girl in the Velcro Dress. And then at the end of the book, it's The Girl in the Painted Dress. And The Girl in the Velcro Dress is something I actually wrote on my blog several years ago, and there was quite a bit of response to it. And so I knew it was something that people resonated with. And so I'm going to read a portion of that story. And it became kind of the way for me to frame the rest of the book. It's an allegory, I guess, and it kind of helped me frame the stories that I wanted to tell that were personal stories. There once was a girl who wore a Velcro dress. In childhood, before any other options were apparent to her, she'd stitched that dress out of bits that had been passed down by her mother and the women who came before. It's to protect you, the women said as they taught her how to sew. We want you to be well prepared for life. Into the stitches were woven expectations from her culture, her religion, her family system, the media, and all the adults who'd grown up with Velcro clothing of their own. The Velcro made it easy for other people to attach things to her. Some people attached rules about how she should behave. Others attached their own needs and the pain they didn't know how to heal. Still others attached disapproval, judgment, rules about good Christian behavior, and expectations about her body. It was such a familiar pattern to have other people's things clinging to her dress that she began picking up pieces that shouldn't have been her responsibility, often saying yes when she wanted to say no. Under the weight of that dress, her own body became an enigma to her, just a vehicle to carry the dress around. By the time she was a young woman, she knew no other life but the one in that dress. The dress gave her a sense of purpose, and people praised her for how much she could carry. Some called her resilient, some called her strong, some called her resourceful, and some called her godly. She gathered those words and stuck them to the dress. A day finally came when the girl could barely breathe under the weight of the dress. Exhausted, she propped the heavy dress up like a concrete tent, slipped down into the cavity it created, curled up in a ball on the floor, and wept. In her tiny cave under the dress, after many tears had been shed, the girl began to fantasize about what it would be like to live without that dress, about how freely she could move through the world without the weight of other people's expectations, judgments, and needs. Guilt quickly consumed her though, and she shook herself out of the dream. Gritting her teeth, she picked herself up off the floor, slipped back into the dress, and carried on. I am resilient, she told herself as she struggled to stand up straight. Once the fantasy was awakened though, it wouldn't let go. Soon she was sneaking away regularly into her little cave, entertaining the dream that another life might be possible. While there, she noticed how different her breath felt, long and slow and filling her whole body. When she wore the dress, her breath was short and fast and a little strangled, but under the dress, it was different. Her body started to feel safe in a way that she'd never felt while wearing the dress. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I want to ask you about the theme of the Velcro dress. Where did that come from?
I don't know where it came from. Like most of my creative ideas, it just lands somehow as I'm looking for some way to reflect on this idea. I was learning a lot about things like generational trauma and really exploring those kinds of questions about myself and about people in general, people I worked with, and trying to help. Often things land because I'm looking for, when I've been doing coaching work or facilitating a retreat or something, I look for creative ways of helping other people explore what they're wrestling with. And I think that's probably where this came from. It's more of a creative, like, how can I help you unravel it in a different way and think about it a little bit differently.
Yeah. And the passage you just read, and throughout the book, you had this idea of the dress looked good for some people, you know, because it fits, you know, the expectations, it fits the ideology that they wanted you to have, but also it was very heavy for you as well at some point. This contradiction, you know, feeling that you're having, what had helped you to realize that, oh my God, this is good, and people are praising me for that, but then at the same time, I don't feel good in it.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty common story that we come to a place where we recognize some discomfort in our lives, some discomfort with the expectations, with even the choices we've made, or the you know, why did we make those choices, and why am I staying in this particular situation that maybe is harmful to me? What's the pressure I'm feeling because of that? And when you start to feel that heaviness, it's hard to imagine yourself outside of that story. And so I was trying to find a way, like I said, to reveal that and to give people, and spoiler alert, the last, like the girl in the painted dress, which is the epilogue, I don't ever end it with the girl having no dress on at all. Like, it's not like she totally.
That's not the intention here.
No, I mean,
it is a different dress.
In the end, she's living with an imperfect dress. She's living with lots of messiness still on her, but then she's done a lot of painting on the underside of it, and the paint is showing through too. So it's this sort of joyful and messy dress, reflecting the fact that we still live in the world. We still live in our families and in our cultures, and we still have to find ways of navigating these systems that we're part of.
That's right. Yeah, and I really appreciate that you said that, because we're still living in the world. There are still some, you know, needs from us to show up, you know, to show up in different spaces with different expectations. And this is where that takes me to the second question about the layout of the book. You know, I remember when I was reading the book, the final copy of it. When I was reading it, and then I was looking at the questions, and I think I told you it feels like I'm in my therapy room reading all these questions, because it's really, they were so fulfilling to read, and I'm sure a lot of people will find that reading the book. So tell me more about that. Tell me more about those reflective questions by the end, because you raise big questions.
Right. So each chapter has 8 to 10 questions after the chapter. And to be totally honest, they weren't my idea. I kind of resisted at first. My editor suggested that I include the questions. My editor was really trying to help me turn it from strictly a memoir into a bit more of a teaching book. And I kind of resisted, and maybe it was the purist in me that wanted it to be a pure memoir, and it felt like I was turning it into something I wasn't quite sure I wanted it to be. Yeah. But I finally listened to her wisdom, and it's actually quite amazing how much response I'm getting to the questions, with people who are reading it and thanking me for the questions. Yeah. So my editor was probably right, and I was right to listen to her advice. So yeah, and I think I'm a lover of good questions. As you know, we've had many conversations, and often one of us just plants a question that we haven't thought of before, and it just allows you to unravel something new. And so I did. Once I agreed to do the questions, I really spent a lot of time reflecting on, so what would help somebody not just read this story, but then find an entry point into it that relates to their own story. I shared a quote in the foreword, I think from Joni Mitchell, I can't remember, but she says, if you hear my songs and you only hear them as my stories, then I'm not doing it right. Like, I want them to be your stories too. I'm not saying it exactly right, but that was kind of my intention all along. It's like, how can I offer these stories to you, but then you see yourself in them? And that was part of the intention with the question is, how can you enter into your own exploration of your stories?
And some of those questions, it will be hard to answer right away, right?
Yeah, I think so.
So yeah,
they're not easy questions. I think they're challenging.
They're very big and deep, and it requires some of them like weeks, in order for you to be revealed with that. So yeah, a lot of work to read this book. So not really. Okay, so throughout, again, going back to the girl in the Velcro dress. So throughout the book, you described in such a beautiful language and such a high level of vulnerability, how some of the concepts, a lot of the concepts actually, that has to do either with, family life, or has to do with culture, has to do with religion, that were stuck to that dress while you either growing up or showing up in different places. What do you think? And I know this is not like, it's hard to answer that, but we'll try. What do you think like the hardest concept was for you? First to notice, and then to acknowledge, and then to go through the process of letting go?
Oh, that's a good question. I think probably one of the hardest was to let go of needing to be the good girl. Because that was how I gained my approval. That's how I was a good student growing up. I was tried to be a good daughter. I was like, I built a lot of persona around being the good girl. And then as I started doing this work, there were choices that I was making that didn't necessarily fit in that good girl persona anymore. Like choices around ending my marriage, for example. When you're raised in a very religious, and we've had many conversations about this, when you're raised in an environment where that's not considered, where it's sinful, to make a choice to end something, even if it's really unhealthy, is a very, very difficult thing. And you have to unravel your own identity. Like, what are people going to think of me?
That's right.
And to make a choice that is authentic to you, and also, of course, I was busy looking after everybody else in my life too, and so those are really difficult things to unravel, because you also know you're potentially hurting other people in those choices too.
And you mentioned art, and you mentioned journal, and you mentioned conversations, and you mentioned as part of your healing too. Is there other things that you would like also to mention and give credit to for?
I think you've covered most of them. I should say I'm a big believer in really connecting with nature and being outside and long walks by myself.
I know.
Yeah. I had a hard time convincing this woman that going for a walk was a good idea. She thought it was just pointless. Why don't you just go outside and go for a walk?
Well, I grew up in a very hot country, so walking outside is not something you should do. You should actually hide from it.
Every once in a while, she would realize we were actually having a good time out in the park, and then she'd say, "Oh, I'm starting to get it now. Why do you go for so many walks?"
She's changing me, really. Yeah, and this is very beautiful to go to our next question, which is, like, obviously I grew up in a completely different culture than you did, but remember the first time when we met, and we had lots of commonality that we didn't actually talk about it. But every time we were talking, we had more and more things revealed that, oh my God, we grew up very similarly, like literally in different part of the world, and that is just crazy to me. But so in the chapter that talks about intersectionality, you spoke about radical love, which I loved, the radical self-love. So and how is that helping people? Could help people also to acknowledge the struggle of other people, and then get to know them better, and get to know them, into a different level of beyond race, beyond different culture, beyond all of that. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was a pretty profound learning for me, and I have to credit Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote a book, The Body Is Not an Apology. And she's a Black woman, a fat Black woman who really went on this journey to learn to love herself, and really recognized in doing it that radical self-love is actually the transformation that the world needs in terms of learning to love the other. If I am really in a state of self-love, I have a radical appreciation and acceptance of my body, however it shows up, then I have capacity to love your otherness. And so for example, there's a chapter in the book about learning to love being a fat woman, and say that word, fat, like even that word. Anybody who's wrestled with weight issues knows that's a stigmatizing word, but to claim that word as, no, I am simply a fat woman living in the world and living joyfully in the world this way. And when I can love that fatness, then I can begin to love somebody who has a disability, or somebody from another culture, different color of skin, or you and I finding like we came from very different cultures and religious backgrounds, but man, like the commonalities like you talk about, but that comes from a place of learning to value yourself. And that idea just kind of changed everything for me, because when I did that work, learning to be tender with myself, learning to love myself, I could be in relationships different. And I know you and I, like, it really deepened that connection. Like it's not like race is not a factor in our relationship. It's still present. We know it's present, but there's something on so much deeper a level that becomes irrelevant when you learn to really love someone, and you have to love yourself in that relationship too.
Yeah. It's not in the center, it's there, but it's acknowledged, but it's not in the center. You're right, I agree with you. Okay, so can we have another passage?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you. So can I invite you to read from the chapter titled "To Hold," a time to hold and a time to live.
Yeah, so possible? Yeah, it is, although I might get a little emotional about this one.
Sorry.
This is a chapter about being a mother and having to learn to let my kids go. I now have kids that are living in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, and they're far away, and I had to go through this in a fairly short period of time.
Yeah.
I had to learn to let them go.
Yeah.
So that's what this is about. You come home from the hospital with a completely dependent baby in your arms, and from that day forward, parenting is an exercise in learning to let go. With each development, the baby becomes more independent and takes a step away from you. One day they're learning to use a spoon without your help, and the next day they're going away for a sleepover at a friend's house. In 2021, I had to learn new lessons in letting my daughters go. The year prior, whenever I considered that two of my daughters were planning to move out at the same time, one to Toronto and one to Vancouver, cities more than 2,000 kilometers away in opposite directions from Winnipeg, I'd find myself dissolving into minor panic attacks. My throat would close, my brain would start to buzz, and suddenly I'd be gasping for air and fighting tears. And then I'd soothe myself by slipping into denial, because really, could this actually happen? Especially during a pandemic when we'd all become so accustomed to hunkering down and barely leaving the house. My mama heart did everything it could to shield me from the thoughts my mama brain was trying to have about this sudden upcoming transition from two full nests to nearly empty nest. Nope, I'd tell myself it likely won't happen. The fourth wave will come. Their universities will shut down, or maybe one of them will change their mind. Then August 2021 arrived, and suddenly it was time for them to start packing for the move. A week before, I was set to leave for the first trip to deliver Nicole to her new school. And by the way, I refer to them as their full names in the book because they asked me to. I don't normally call her Nicole, she's Nikki, but in the book you'll see all of them have requested their full names being used. And they all gave me permission to tell these stories too, by the way. A week before I was set to leave for the first trip to deliver Nicole to her new school, where she intended to add a jewelry design degree to her fine arts degree, I wrenched my back so badly I could hardly move. For a week, I was in so much pain, I didn't know how I'd sit in a car for the three-day drive to Toronto, help Nicole move her belongings up 2 flights of stairs, and then make the trip back home again. I tried everything I could to resolve it: physiotherapy, chiropractor, massage, acupuncture. By the time we were set to leave, the pain was more manageable. I drove with the sticky pads of a TENS machine attached to my back, as my physiotherapist suggested, flicking the switch to send little electrical jolts into my muscles when the pain flared up. By the time we were in Toronto, my back was strong enough that I could carry boxes up to her 3rd floor room. I spent 4 days in Toronto getting used to the idea that I would leave Nicole behind in the middle of this big, busy city, and she would begin a life without me nearby. She'd learned to navigate the city on her own, and when I came back to visit, my status as well-traveled expert / mom would have diminished, and she would know these streets better than I would. We made multiple trips to Walmart and IKEA until her small room was fully stocked with the things that would be harder to attain when she no longer had access to a car. I watched her decide on cleaning products and bed sheets, and sometimes she'd turn to ask my opinion. I paused before giving it, wondering whether this was a moment when she needed a mom's expertise or if she needed to choose for herself. I gave opinions tentatively, knowing whatever she bought would all belong in a home that was not mine to manage or care for. Mostly, I just provided the transportation and furniture assembly skills. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. A week after arriving home, I was ready to set out again, this time heading west to Vancouver, where I would leave Madeline on campus at the University of British Columbia. We packed the car one more time, and this time Julie came with us. She would be the only one returning home with me. In BC, we passed places where forest fires were still burning, and we watched helicopters dropping water from the sky. The grief of a burning world threatened to consume me, but I pushed the thought away, knowing I only had enough capacity to hold the grief that was right in front of me. I worried for Madeline, though. So primed to pay attention to the grief and fear of climate change that she'd become a climate activist 2 years earlier. How would she be able to hold all that as she dove deeper into environmental studies. She joked that her time at university would be short because the planet would be destroyed soon.
That is sober.
Yeah, but under her sardonic humor, I knew there was pain. I think I'll stop there. It's about as much as I can do with that chapter.
Thank you for sharing that with us, really. Motherhood. Yeah, so I have a question about motherhood. Okay, so yes, well, you know, like we are in different stages of motherhood, and it's just this dynamic, you know, fluid relationship that you have with your kids. Like one day they need you, 100%. Some days they need you 0%, and you're happy about it, and then you're sad about it because you're grieving that relationship with them. And then one day you are the main, like responsible person for them, and then after that you're just only a consultant for them.
Yeah.
And that hurts. So tell us how tenderness had helped you to navigate that.
Yeah.
To navigate all that different roles that you have to take with them, taking them into this journey and the four of you have a lot of journeys together.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more.
So one of the things you'll read if you read that chapter is that during the pandemic, my youngest daughter, Maddie, was quite sick and had a life-threatening illness. And we were, wow, I didn't think I'd be quite this emotional. And so we had to spend a lot of time protecting her. And that was that became our family's purpose in that time, was how can we, because her illness put her at a high risk. She has an autoimmune disorder. Her trachea kept closing, and it meant that if she'd gotten COVID, we didn't know if she'd live. And she had to have 10 surgeries in the course of 2 years. And so it was a really intense time for all of us. And then after all of this, then they all decided to move away. After this really intense time of being in this tight family unit, they all decided to move away. But also during that time, it was actually on the anniversary of my mom's death. I was sitting there, and I think I'll read that that was the last passage we talked about in the reading, but it was the anniversary of my mom's death, and I was just feeling some of the grief of that. And it was almost like this presence came and sat beside me. And I call it tenderness, and I'll read how that showed up. But it was like, there was this invitation to just stop being hard on myself. Stop, and I think it's related to this idea of radical self-love. It's like, how can you be incredibly compassionate to yourself in this moment? How can you let yourself hold all of this big grief, all of the fear that the pandemic was, all of the intensity? How can you just be really, really tender and allow that to be big feelings? And and then losing my mom and the anniversary of her death and stuff. How can you hold that with tenderness that doesn't force you to just get on with it? Because that's so much a part of our lives, is how do we just get on with it?
Right.
But after that, I started inviting that into my journal, and I would write these conversations with tenderness and ask tenderness, like, how can I treat myself today? And that became part of that transition of having my children, supporting them to move away. And I had to develop a different relationship with myself, because now suddenly I was spending most of my time alone. And I wanted to be in a really loving relationship with myself. And so it was part of that evolution, I think.
Wow. Wow. Not like the usual way to deal with something as big as that. Like, what I mean? This idea is like, I'm just gonna sit with it. I'm just gonna sit with it. I'm gonna see what comes from it. So speaking of tenderness, going just back a little bit to it, where do you see it living? Do you see it living in the story, in the way you're holding pain for yourself and for other people, in the way you're holding love also, and compassion for yourself and for other people? Where do you see it living?
Well, part of my evolution of this idea of tenderness was that from the very start, it was something that was outside of me. And not only outside of me, it's also inside of me, but I think it really felt important for me to be able to lean into it instead of me having to create it myself. Because I think so much of the language around self-care, I have to do it for myself. It's in the name of it, self-care. And so it's one more burden for already busy, already overworked people. It's like, oh, now I got to do self-care too. You know, and so, and like we live in a pretty individualistic culture. And so we have self-care sections of the bookstore that are full of books about how to take care of yourself. And that's not bad, but where are the books on other care? Where are the books on community? Where are the books on accessing the resources that are available to us that we don't have to create ourselves or evolve ourselves? And so I mean, it is a spiritual kind of sense of tenderness as well. And you know, it could be the language around God, if that's resonant for people. Whatever language feels like, what's holding me, what's supporting me, what can I lean into and trust will hold me in a way that I maybe don't know how to hold myself.
Oh, that's beautiful. So it's not something that we have to create. It's not that something we have to go to, something that we have to create. Like, maybe it's nice to create a space for it, you know, like an outside space.
I think that's one of the reasons why I spend so much time out walking in the woods or in my new home on Vancouver Island. I'm right by this really lovely little lake.
Yeah.
And it's so much easier to access tenderness outside for me. Like when I can sit and watch the sunset or something like that, it feels like the earth is offering it up to me in some way.
Wow. So it's different for people, I think.
I think so, yeah.
So some people will find it in nature, some people will find it, okay.
I also find it in a good hot bath at the end of the day.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's something that you look for it within your own, let's just say, routine or your own, you know, like your own self. Okay, that makes sense. So last question before we go, because we also need to be aware of the time.
And we want to open it up for some questions too.
Yes, that's right. So now from the girl with the Velcro dress to the girl on a painted dress,
right?
As we promised, there is a dress. So there are a lot of stories that you talked about and you explained and you took us with you in just such a beautiful and wonderful way. Now, where are you from their stories? Are they like somewhere still staying the same way? What are your relationships?
Oh
with
yeah.
them?
Well, you already know the answer to this question.
but I still need to hear it.
And the reason I say that is that like we've been friends now for 8 years.
Yes.
And we have a lot of stories that we've told at the beginning of our relationship and we tell very differently now.
That's true.
And I think that's where I stand with that. Like none of my stories, in fact, both times I've published a book, there's a little reluctance in me because you put something down on a page, people assume it stays the same, but it never does. Like my relationship with every story changes. My relationship with the people in the stories changes. I have a chapter on my mom, for example, and even though she's been dead a number of years, I still have an evolving relationship with how she lives in me and in my life. And so it's not static. Yeah. And we keep living into new versions of our stories. And so, I'll keep evolving them. So maybe there'll be a 25th anniversary edition that'll come out.
I told you that, right? I told you should write, you should keep us to date, about like the stories. Where are you now from those stories?
I don't know. Maybe somebody can give me a good idea of what the girl in the painted dress becomes 25 years later. Maybe there's another version. Okay. I don't know. We'll
that can be one of the reflective questions, Okay, well, can we have another passage in tenderness as well?
Sure.
Thank you so
much. So just a little context, this is in a chapter called Becoming Tender, and I start the chapter talking about a therapy session where I started to recognize that I was resisting joy in my life, that I didn't know how to act, and I was almost afraid of joy because it felt too vulnerable. A few weeks later, on the anniversary of the day my mom died, the following words flowed onto my journal page almost without conscious thought. I am sitting with tenderness this morning. Tenderness filled my teacup with green tea, steeped to just the right amount of strength, and then she added honey for the sweetness. Tenderness invited me to sit near the window where the sun shines in. You need the vitamin D, she said, and the warmth. Tenderness gently reminds me of what today is, the anniversary of the day I became an orphan. Tenderness knows even adults become orphans when they lose their mothers. She lets me feel all of the feelings I need to feel, and she expects nothing in return. Tenderness invites me to bring my journal to my seat by the window to linger a little longer before I start my work. She knows I need extra time this morning, and she's spent many years teaching me to guard spaces on my calendar for times like these. Tenderness was there with me 2 days ago when a beloved friend told me that he's dying. She held my hand when I committed to that friend that I'd be on the hard and holy journey with him, no matter how much it hurts. She was also there with me a few days before that when another dear friend told me about the layers of pain she's unraveling as she prepares to free herself of a story that has long kept her chained to shame that shouldn't be hers to hold. And she was there on Sunday night when I couldn't be in the emergency room with my faraway daughter and had to sit and wait for news. Tenderness knows a lot about mother love. Tenderness reminds me that these stories, dying moms, dying friends, wounded friends, sick daughters, need slowness, spaciousness, and hearts that have enough room to be open. She knows they need green tea with honey and a leather-bound journal with a favorite pen. Tenderness doesn't give two hoots for productivity. She's not fond of timelines or to-do lists. She has a habit of pulling me away from computer screens and sending me into the woods or under the thick blanket made by my mother's hands from the wool of my father's sheep. I don't know exactly where tenderness came from, but I know that she showed up exactly when I needed her, when I was ready to treat myself differently. Right from the start, she was mostly external to me, as though it were too big a step for me to imagine that she was a part of me. It was easier to receive the love offered to me by this practice if I didn't have to feel responsible for initiating or channeling that love.
Wow, thank you. What a beautiful being you're describing. Thank you so much. I love you, you know that. And I love you so much. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And thank you for coming to Winnipeg. Oh my God, it's amazing to see you again. So yeah, I'll just leave the question for the floor to question for other people because I ask you a lot and I keep asking you. So yeah, I'll just keep it for other people.
Right.
Okay, anybody have any questions?
It's not a question, but it's a comment. Decades ago, I was at a conference that had to do with violence against women. And there was a young woman who was presenting. She worked with, she supported girls on the street at downtown East Side in Vancouver who were cutting themselves because of abuse. And she stood there, and as she presented, she was weeping. I'll never forget this because she didn't try. It didn't affect her speech at all. So her tears were, and she was. So today, when I come to McNally for a book launch, I don't necessarily expect the presenter to share her tears with us. And I just want to say that if we could create, oh dear, space in this world where we can share our words and our tears, my God, it might just make a difference. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, that was really beautiful. And yeah, we all agree. I think we can feel the affection of your friendship and your vulnerability tonight. So that's great.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned to let the tears flow, and I have a lot of time, a lot of opportunity to be in teaching circles and learning circles with other people, and to run a lot of retreats and things like that. And I've really welcome. When people are ready to crack open enough that tears are gonna flow, that's when you know something deep and meaningful is gonna show up. So I try not to let them, try not to stop them even when they're in my own eyes. Thank you.
Do you have any more questions or comments?
Oh, I'm just realizing how many people walked in while I was looking away. It's so lovely to see so many of my people from my past lives here. Janelle.
Thanks, Heather. I'm curious about, as a writer, this is, you know, your second book. You've written so many wonderful things that I've enjoyed. What is the most challenging thing for you as a writer, sort of taking the words in your head and getting them down on paper? What feels the most challenging for you?
Well, to be honest, really honest with you, the writing is rarely particularly challenging for me. I can write, people are often amazed how much content I can put out on social media and books and things like that, but it flows quite naturally from me. What's challenging is the editing process. I can see Krista shake her head because she had to listen. Krista's my business partner, who's up here. She had to listen to me vent throughout the process, especially of editing this book. Because once you, I can write and I'm alone in my home, or I'll go away. I often will go away to a cabin in the woods to write because that's where I do my best writing. And when I'm alone with my words, I'm in this lovely little relationship with my words. And then somebody critiques them, and it becomes a whole different thing, and I get defensive of my words, or I get, it becomes personal. And so, yeah, that's the most difficult part. And yet I always know that the editing process is a good process, and I've had really good editors who, really have made the work more beautiful. So I trust that process, but I have to go through the pain of it to get there. Thanks for the question.
Hi, I'm a teacher, and I wondered if you would, or have you considered writing a children's book about this so that we could get them started early on the concept and on being kind to themselves?
Yeah, I've actually, when I first wrote The Girl in the Velcro Dress, I had a lot of people send me messages saying, can you turn that into a children's book? Because it would translate really naturally into a children's book. So I do sort of in the back of my mind have that in mind, that at some point I will turn it into a children's book. If you want to talk to me, if you have any ideas, I'd be happy to hear them, because I know you're immersed in that and work. And I know there's others, and we have a children's book author right here in the front. So I do have some, so it's definitely something that could happen in the future.
Another editing process for you.
Another editing process. Thanks.
Kristen,
Thanks for that reminder.
Since you brought it up.
So,
in writing my little story, and it sounds like the arc of your story, we don't live in a vacuum.
mm-hmm.
How do you know, how do you edit? What is your story?
Yeah.
And what is someone else's story? Whether that's your parents, your siblings, your children, your neighbor, your friend. How do you make those decisions? And just for you personally, I mean, I've got my story, you've got your story, but for you, if this is a book of stories, how do you know what's your story?
Yeah, and I know you were telling a pretty personal story in yours as well, so you're coming from a place of familiarity. It's a really tough question, especially with a book like this, where I did write some really personal stories, and I had to be able to write them with the other people in the stories, because they weren't full stories without the other people in them. And so I went through so many agonizing processes to try to determine what right do I have to tell these stories? Am I being fair in these stories? And in the end, I had to claim them as my stories, and simply make that choice to say, I have a right to tell these stories because I've lived them, and other people may be offended by them, may not love the way I told them. It's quite possible, and I had to go through quite a process, especially in the editing process, to make sure it was like that I was clean with my relationship with the stories. But I think you just have to come to a point where if in not sharing those stories, you're not being true to yourself, then you may be denying yourself something. And so I didn't want to necessarily put other people's right to those stories above my own. They can tell their own version of the stories. And so it was a self-honoring process to come to a place of, yes, I get to tell these stories, as hard as that might be. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Can you give us an update on the daughters?
The daughters. Well, it's possible they're watching on YouTube right now, so I have to watch my words when I say. They're doing great, actually. My oldest daughter, she did go to Toronto to study jewelry design, but found it really challenging. It didn't work very well with her particular brain and personality, and so she ended up getting a job that suits her really well at the Royal Conservatory of Music, working in the arts world. My second daughter just recently moved to Montreal, and she's becoming a writer. That's one of her primary interests, and she was shortlisted for a CBC Writing Prize last year, so that was quite exciting. So she's trying to find her path in writing, and in the meantime is working at a Mexican restaurant in Montreal and just loving it, really loves the city. My youngest daughter, Maddie, is in Vancouver. She's the one I get to see the most because I now live on Vancouver Island, and she's in university in her 4th year studying Indigenous studies and geography, and probably will keep going into a master's or PhD. I'm not quite sure. She's actually, right now, and maybe I'm saying too much, she'll have to forgive me if I'm saying too much about her personal story, but she's, one of the interests she's developed is that, because she's both Mennonite and Métis, so she's interested in exploring that intersection of Mennonite and Métis, and so that, and I say that partly, this is Di Brandt, who's a poet, also from a Mennonite background, so has some of the same history, so I thought that might be a little tidbit you might be interested in. Yeah.
I have a question to piggyback off of that a little bit. Do you think that raising 3 daughters has sort of led you to this interior work in a certain way, and just the way that women look at themselves? And then if you look at a young woman and you say, oh boy, if I'm not doing this, then how will I teach them how to do this? Hoping for that for them as well. I mean, I'm still speaking to my friends sometimes where we have to stop each other and be like, okay, we're being a little bit too hard on ourselves, or this or that. And it's like a constant, it's a constant work. Yeah. And do you have this ability to communicate with your daughter about how vulnerable you feel or how much work you're putting into all of it all the time?
Yeah, it's been a real journey. Anybody who's a parent knows that we don't necessarily want to pass on all of our baggage, and yet we inadvertently we do, not meaning to, and there have certainly been times when my kids have come to me to let me know that maybe I'm passing on something, and I've tried to create a really an environment where they can be honest with me, and so we've had to work through some hard things. One of my daughters came to me, she'd been through therapy, and she came to me to kind of call me out on some things choices I'd made when she was in her teen years, and I had to swallow my tongue and avoid the first reaction back to her, to defend myself and my mothering, and listen to her and listen. And she was absolutely right. And I had to be as humble as possible to receive that. So it's been a real evolution in our recent years as they've grown into young adults, where, like you say, I moved from the primary parenting to how can I walk alongside them and still model for them, but model in a way that is admitting of my mistakes and admitting where I messed up, and I'm still trying to evolve. And so we have a lot of really great conversations actually about things like how we feel about our bodies, how we love our bodies, how we are in relationship. And then my kids are all pretty big picture thinkers in terms of like naming what is the patriarchy, what is capitalism, how is capitalism influencing our choices or the way we treat our bodies. So it's absolutely been part of my journey, is like wanting to evolve for myself, but also wanting to evolve for them. Like and I feel so lucky to continue to have an evolving relationship in that way with them. Thanks for that question.
Oh, we have a few more. So I know that you have traveled the world, done 2 books, got these courses going, full-bodied life, Substack, the podcasts. What's next?
Rest. Lots of Part of the reason for coming back to Manitoba, as some of you know, is I'm cleaning out the storage unit that I sold my house nearly 2 years ago and set off on this. I was living nomadically internationally for about 16 months, and now I've settled on Vancouver Island, and I've been in motion for quite some time, and in the process launching another book, launching several new programs. And what I'm just really craving is just long stretches of being able to walk in the woods and be by the seashore and walk by the lake. And I'm having a lot of fun on the island, learning about the ecosystem there, learning about mushrooms on Vancouver Island. Like, I'm reading books about mushrooms and fungi and mosses and things like that. And that feels like what's next. That's really kind of energizing me to learn those kinds of things and be in relationship with the natural world and notice myself as a part of nature. So that's kind of my exploratory edge right now. Thanks for asking.
Okay, that's fine. I'm gonna take you back a long way.
Yeah.
I know that you have journaled and been a creator and a communicator for many years. When, at what point did you decide or realize that your words and your stories were worth sharing?
I mean, I think there are a couple of moments that I recognized the impact of my words. One of them came fairly early in my 20s. I suffered a violent sexual assault in my early 20s. And the way that I worked through my healing on that was already in my early 20s, was about writing and journaling, writing about it. I ended up writing a play about it, and it was produced at the Black Hole Theatre at U of M. And noticing how people responded to my written word at that time, and it was turned into a play on stage. So that was the early seeds of it, recognizing, oh, there's something here that I have, that I want to continue to cultivate. And then, as happens, I spent a lot of years raising children and having a career. I worked in government and nonprofit, and most of my writing was focused on writing press releases for the government and things like that. So I didn't do a lot in those intervening years. But then in the, I want to say early 2000s, when blogging first became a thing, I started putting a blog out there, and a few people in the room. Michelle, I see, is out there. It was in the early days, and Cynthia, my sister, had a blog. We had these really baby blogs in those early days that nobody was reading, but 5 people were reading. But then all of a sudden I wrote a post, and it happened to be about my former husband had attempted suicide, and I wrote about that, and got a random email from somebody in India who said my post had helped them choose to live and instead of ending their life. And it was one of those moments like, wow, like by putting this out there, this vulnerable sharing about my story, somebody else is, hanging on to life. And so it felt like a responsibility at that point. It felt like, well, this is something that I can give into the world, and I gotta keep doing it.
Where did you find that initial courage, just to put to write that blog, to share those things with people other than yourself?
That's a good question. I don't know if I think it's an internal thing. I think it's just digging down deep again and again, because it's not like I don't have a whole lot of discouragement too, and a whole lot of times when I sometimes regret what I've written, or it's challenges me or people respond to it in ways that feel hurtful. All of that happens, all of that's true. It's not all a fun path. But there's something just really eternal in the core of me that knows it's the right thing to do. And so I keep showing up for it. And in the process, I've had a lot of people show up alongside me and have great conversations, you being one of them. We used to sit in coffee shops and talk about this kind of thing when in the early days when I was first beginning to write on my blog and stuff. So the encouragement of other people and people like Krista and Sally here and other people in the room that show up alongside me, that's part of, I mean, it's in community too, is where the courage comes from. Yeah, and then people like you, and a few of you came to my creative writing workshop when I used to teach writing workshops years ago. Some people are in the room when I very first time I started teaching about it. So yeah. And then you keep showing up for some reason. So it's working. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's maybe a good place to land tonight. Let's thank Saleha and Heather warmly.
So we have recently launched a podcast. Krista and I have launched a podcast and a community kind of space that we're trying to get people engaged with called A Tender Space. And it's on Substack, tenderspace.substack.com. If you become a paid subscriber on it, you'll get a weekly, we call them lunchbox notes from Tenderness. This was Krista's bright idea, because you know when you were a child and you'd get a little, every once in a while your mom might tuck a lovely little note, a lunchbox note into your lunchbox, and it was just such a lovely little thing to find. So that's what we're calling them. You can subscribe and get these weekly in your inbox. We have a random sampling of them, and I wanted to send everybody home with at least one little note from Tenderness. So make sure you get one of these before you go today.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe we can bring them over to the signing desk. So if you get your book signed, you can pick up a copy of
And even if you don't get your book signed, or if you've already bought one, you can still come and grab one. It's not just for people who buy books. Tenderness is available.
Okay, thank you so much again for the warm conversation, the vulnerability, and thank you for your engagement and the lovely conversation tonight. As I said before, we're going to be bringing Heather over to the signing table, so we ask you to sit for a few moments while she gets settled in over there. And there will be copies of her books over at the cash desk and the signing desk. So feel free to pick one up, get it signed, but please remember to pay for it before you leave, if you don't mind. Okay, thank you so much again. Yes, have a good evening.